So let's just start with a little grounding in the subject. I remember a few years ago when UCLA's Civil Rights Project released a report naming New York State as the most segregated state for black children in the country and New York City as the most segregated school system in the country. I remember distinctly the headlines all across the land were, "You will never believe where the most segregated schools in the country are. They are not in the South." For those of us who have been studying segregation for a long time, we've known that the most segregated schools in the country have not been in the South for 4 decades. It is only that because we are progressive in the city and we believe that this is a place that would never tolerate segregation that we have allowed ourselves to deny what has been going on in the city for more than 4 decades, 5 decades, 6 decades. I can say in 1954, when Brown v. Board was passed, there already had been a long history of New York City parents, black and Puerto Rican parents, battling against school segregation in the city at the time of Brown, and they believed that Brown didn't only stand for desegregation in the South, but also desegregation right here in New York City. And in fact, the largest demonstration for civil rights in the history of our country happened right here in New York City in 1964 when 500,000 black and Puerto Rican parents held their children outside of school to demand integration for their kids. So I think it's very important to understand that to begin to even have this discussion, we need to tackle this myth that somehow the folks up here are better at race than in the South, and that this is a problem that is new here or that we would not allow. So how about some facts? The fact is this country is resegregating the schools, particularly for black children, and that black children are more segregated now than they have been at any point in our country since 1972. And not only are they more segregated racially, but now because more middle-class black parents are able to opt into integrated schools, these kids are facing a double segregation that is unprecedented, where they are attending schools that are almost entirely black and brown and almost entirely poor, which we all know, any educator knows, is absolutely devastating for the learning environment. What are the facts in New York City? New York City, about 3 of 4 black kids attend an intensely segregated school. That means a school where one of 10 students are white. And 1 of 3 black kids in the city attend what the UCLA Civil Rights Project calls apartheid schools. They call it apartheid schools for a reason. They want it to jar you. And these are schools where 1% or fewer of kids are white. 1 of 3 black kids. For Latinos, it's not quite as bad, but it's still pretty bad. For Latinos, 3 of 5 are attending intensely segregated schools. And as we know, black and Latino kids tend to be segregated together. And for Latinos, 1 of 5 are attending what are called apartheid schools. And in charter schools, of course, that's worse. 73% of charter school students are 73% of charter schools in the city are considered apartheid schools. Now, the inverse of that is half of the white students in the city are concentrated in just 7% of the schools. And that is also the same for Asian students. Most of them are concentrated in just 6% of schools. So that's where we are, and that's where we're going to begin the conversation, is understanding that there is deep and intense and unequal segregation happening in our city. And the last framework before I ask the first question is I want us to think about integration in a way differently than we are talking about it. I think we tend to talk about integration as the same thing as diversity. And when we call it diversity, that means that it's something that feels good, it's something that's nice if you can have it, it's a bonus. Integration is about equity and integration is about justice. And that's the way that we're going to frame this conversation, because we have never, for a second in this country, provided black and Latino school children who are separated from white children in equal education. So when we're talking about integration, we cannot look at this as a bonus or something that's nice. We have to know that the only thing that research has shown works on scale to provide the same quality of education for black and Latino kids is to be in the same classrooms as white and Asian kids. So to begin, I would like each of the panelists to start let's ground this conversation in our own experiences. We all have gone to school, and we have either gone to schools that were segregated or integrated. So if you could each just briefly, and as a moderator, I will cut you off, just so you know, even if you're not just my husband. So I want to try to get through a lot of questions. Briefly say whether you believe you went to an integrated or segregated school, and if you have children, what type of schools your children are in now.
I have to say that until 4th grade, I went to private schools, which were quite segregated. After that, I went to public schools, and I believe that they were possibly integrated, because I did come from a socioeconomically diverse district, but there was a significant amount of tracking, and I was probably only in gym classes and health classes with kids who were not white. My kids are in 5th and 7th grade in District 15. One of them is at Park Slope Collegiate, run by Jill Bloomberg, and that's a very integrated school. And my 5th grader is at PS 10, and I looked up the numbers after you asked me, and it's 32% Latino, 48% white. And it has gotten, since my current 7th grader started there in kindergarten, it has gotten much more white since he first started.
Thank you.
Michelle. The schools that I went to were segregated. I mean, they were hyper-segregated. I can't remember a white student in the class. Maybe in first grade, Eric in the first grade, and then
I'm sorry, where did you grow up? And I should have asked this, but if you could also say where you grew up.
I grew up in Brooklyn, District 17, where I teach now. I went to school there, you know, up until high school, and it's really close to Prospect Heights, but really it was Crown Heights. And I came in, I remember when I was going to the school for the first grade, for the first time at my local parochial school, I remember walking down Lincoln Place towards Franklin Avenue, and I was amazed, you know, even at that young age, I had a race consciousness. And I was amazed to see one of the 5th grade teachers, Miss Patterson, she lived in the first floor apartment on Lincoln Place. And that was the last year she was gonna be living there, and she was probably like the last white teacher, white person in the neighborhood, because it was, you know, the white flight, and that, you know, we were catching the tail end of that. But yeah, very segregated. My son, I have a kindergartner, and we live in District 32, which is also very, very segregated, every single school. And I didn't want him to have the same kind of, you know, schooling that I had, hyper segregated. So I was determined, District 32, to escape District 32 for my son. And so he ended up at District 15, at PS 261, which is a very integrated school. I mean, you know, I walk in the schoolyard and it's like, wow, the United Nations is, you know, so much.
Thank you. Jill?
So I grew up in the suburbs of St. Louis. My elementary school was almost completely segregated. There was one black student, Franz. So in my high school, my high school participated in a voluntary desegregation plan between the suburbs and the city of St. Louis. So the school was about 30% black, but like Miriam's experiences, very heavily tracked. And so most of my classes had very few black students, with the exception of band and gym.
I grew up in North Carolina. My dad was in the military, so for over 20 years. With that makes me an Army brat. So I can't necessarily, I'm pretty much from everywhere, so to speak. So I went to Department of Defense schools, where I went to the same schools as the officers' kids. We lived on the same housing areas as the officers' kids, even with ones who had, you know, higher salaries than my father. We all shared the same quality resources. We had computer labs in every, we had a computer in every classroom. We had computer labs. We had foreign language. We had music. We had extracurricular activities. We had after school. It was an experience that you can only dream of. And with that came a overall perspective of who my friends were, the people that I associated with. On the side of that, my dad did, we had to spend a couple months in Cairo, Georgia to finish up my 6th grade year. And I did go to a segregated school where they didn't have computers. I was actually typing faster than some of my instructors. It was very telling because you can tell that there were no white kids that went to my school. We were with the majority black. That's my story.
And your child?
Oh, my child is, I'm sorry. My child is in kindergarten at PS 307.
I grew up in the Bronx, District 11, but as of right now, I don't really go to school there. I go to Brooklyn Technical High School, which is a it's a specialized high school. And I also have a couple friends with me, too, who go to the school as well. You know, shout out Aminata, Starian, Edie, and a teacher who goes there, too, Mrs. Stevens. And that school is I can't safely say that it is very deeply segregated. Like, the majority of the students in that school are Asian and white. And to me, it was a very big shock because it was completely different from how my education went back in my district 11. Because you see, in my junior high school, it was mostly black and Latino. And, you know, like, so, you know, in schools like that with majority black and Latino, there's a lot of things that come with it. You know, the school is underfunded. The school has not so good resources, barely any computers. You know, occasional metal detectors, because for some reason they may not trust us to come inside the school without any weapons, for some reason. But so yeah, it was completely. I never realized how different that junior high school was from the high school until I went to the high school. In the high school, they gave us a lot more leniency. The high school was a much better resources, you know, and the difference in resources, the difference in opportunity between my junior high school and my high school. My high school with majority Asian and white students, and my junior high school with Latino and black students, it was very noticeable. You see, in my junior high school, I was the top of my class, you know, and to be honest, it wasn't too hard for me to reach, I guess you could say, the top. You know, it wasn't that hard for me. But then moving on to high school, I realized, you know, I was very mediocre. I was really in the sea of white and Asian students, just this mediocre kid, and I really wasn't prepared. My junior high school, which is not well funded, it wasn't too good of a school. It didn't really prepare me for life in this elite school, you know, and that just seems to be the pattern for a lot of students, a lot of black students that I've met in my high school, you know, and I guess that kind of attaches to the fact that there's barely any black students in my high school. There's about like around 400 something black students in my high school. My high school is 5,600. 5,600 students, like 400 black students. And the number keeps getting smaller and smaller. For example, I think the numbers came in for the acceptance rate of like black students in specialized high schools. It was around like 100, 110. And you probably, I don't know if you noticed or not, but like my high school, my specialized high school, even though it's a small percentage, 400 black students, we still have the largest amount of black students in the specialized high schools. You know, other specialized high schools, they barely have any black students. So that being said, going back to that 100 and 110 students being accepted, a large amount of those black students are most likely going to Brooklyn Tech, and in a small amount, maybe like 20, are going to be separated, divided, and go to those other specialized high schools. And mind you, this number of black students getting accepted into these high schools are getting lower and lower and lower and lower. So, I mean, what does that tell you? So me personally, what I get from that is maybe these black and Latino students are coming from schools that don't really prepare them, or not as funded, you know, for whatever reason. Maybe it's because it's black and Latino, they don't see maybe that much. For some reason, they may not see the reason to fund these schools, but for whatever reason, these schools aren't properly funded. They don't get the proper resources, so a lot of these students don't get prepared to enter into this, you know, elite competitive schools, you know.
Thank you, Nathaniel. Tequila.
So I'm Tequila, and I was born and raised in East New York, like my mother and my grandmother before me since 1918. Actually, my mom's there. Hi. Sorry, I got distracted. So I attended a segregated parochial school for the first 3 years. It was entirely Black and Latino. And then dissatisfied with the quality of that education, my mother searched and found a program that was outside of my neighborhood, but still within an entirely Black and Latino neighborhood, where I attended a segregated school for 4th and 5th, and then did middle school 6th, 7th, and 8th also in Bushwick, which was also segregated. We had one Asian student, Roland Wong. It's crazy how we remember people's names, and it really is telling when you think about what that means, because I'm 42. So it's like good memory. Yeah, that speaks a lot to everyone's experience. I think Roland's experience and all of our experiences as well. So then I actually ended up at a specialized science school. I went to Bronx Science for high school, which was my first foray into, I think we're calling it integrated, because back in the 80s when I joined, there were more than like 2 Black people, unlike now. We're all on Facebook and we all kind of go, where are all the Black students now? Because there's so many of us now, in the 80s. And so as an educator, I really wonder what shifted in the educational system over the last 15 to 20 years to create some additional barriers to people passing these tests. Because for the record, not myself or any of my friends, we did not study for that thing. And one friend I know in particular did not want to go, and she knew that if she got in, her mother would make her. So she like messed up purposefully and ended up at Stuyvesant. So, so there's a lot of things we have to really interrogate. So I'm the mother of a child who's in 5th grade who just went through the glorious middle school process. And right now we live in District 15. He attends Brooklyn New School, which I found out is 44% white, 56% children of color right now. I have to say that we live in a neighborhood where we're 3 blocks away from a zone school. And when I went to visit the school, I didn't want my child to be the only Black child in the class, which is when he was 5, I felt like that's not the Brooklyn experience I wanted him to have. So we were grateful to be able to have him attend this integrated school. Lo and behold, 6 years later, I'm looking at middle schools and I have conundrums around what it will look like for my child as an adolescent. And I think this is a really great conversation. I'm glad to be a part of it. We have a lot to unpack.
We do. Okay, so we should just quickly say the data on the specialized high school shows that the Black and Latino population admittance rate has actually dropped, and I think those who got admitted this year, 6% Black, 4% Latino, in a city that is majority Black and Latino. So we should point that out, that clearly something is not working when you're getting those numbers. So let's just start. I want to just quickly note that everyone on this panel either has a child in a disproportionately white school, right? Everyone, I think, except you, Mr. Hannah Jones. And so we're speaking about a panel on segregation with no families except for this one middle-class family who is not represented either, of the kids who are actually in the segregated schools. So I just want to note that maybe next time we can get someone who's representing all of those kids who are actually in the segregated schools that we're talking about. So let's begin. I'm just going to ask a couple of you, not all of you, to say, what do you think from your different roles as both parents and advocates and educators is the biggest obstacle to integrated schools in this city? And briefly, the biggest obstacle.
Well, if we're talking about elementary school, I think the issue is the way students are assigned to schools.
So,
I guess it's the way students are assigned to schools all across the city. That you have, either zoning on the elementary school level, or in the districts that have school choice for middle school, as opposed to zoned middle schools. Where there's choice, you're always going to end up with segregation.
Okay. So it's student assignment.
Yeah.
Which, of course, is what's remarkable about that is both when you're doing a neighborhood school model and a choice model, we are producing the same segregated results, which we will unpack. Anyone else, like a couple other people want to say? Joe?
Yeah, I mean, I think the short answer is racism. So racism is a creation that has, since its inception, meant to divide people, and it's been doing that for the last 400 or 500 years of American history. So we've been taught that we are different, and we've been forcibly separated from each other in lots and lots and lots of ways, and there's nothing that the New York City Public Schools has done to overcome that. So Michelle and I were talking in the back about this idea that integration should happen organically, and she raised the point that assumes that somehow the segregation happened organically. It didn't. So the segregation wasn't organic, and the integration's not going to be organic either. It's something we have to create.
I'm going to say capital and resources. Many of you know about the rezoning debate at 307. And before we found out about that zoning, we really wanted to find out why the school was being rezoned and find out who it was going to impact. And it was kind of obvious that 307 was going to be mostly impacted because you're talking about a school that is 90% Black and Latino. Almost the majority are qualified for free and reduced lunch. With that comes the location of the school, which is directly across the housing project, the Farragut community. You have parents there who actually are concerned about the situation regarding zoning, but they also don't know how to exercise the ability to get political and financial capital. With that is resources, because before the conversation of rezoning came about, it was 307 basically had to use their own expertise to get their own resources. And a lot of that fell on some of the members of leadership.
Okay, so I'm going to bring you back to the question.
Sure.
What do you think is the biggest obstacle to integrated schools in the city? And it can't be, I mean, it could be particular to 307, but
Right.
what is the obstacle that you're trying to get at?
Capital and resources. Families who want to advocate on behalf of their school, being able to exercise the ability to tap in to financial funding for their school, and also educational tools and curriculums for their school for those kids that go to these Title I type of schools, the schools that are in mostly impoverished neighborhoods. So I would say capital and resources.
It's extremely important. I work in Brownsville, and so I hear a lot of stories from parents, and I'm sort of experiencing firsthand the struggles that they're dealing with, and it really does in some ways feel like people are left behind. And so I think we have to think about kind of how we conflate race and class together and thinking about gentrification and where people are living. Like, neighborhoods are so segregated. Schools are reflections of the neighborhoods. And so we have to also think about how schools sit in the larger context, like the economic, the social, the housing policies and patterns that impact where people live and how we can actually interact, and then who's left, who wants to go to that school, and if you can make another choice, you will. What happens to the schools that are left there? So I think we really have to tease apart the complexities of what's happening here.
Absolutely. Okay, so Jill, so you are at a school that has been kind of in the center of this battle for integration and equity. And as I told you backstage, I think you've been remarkably brave about speaking out on these issues when you are in fact employed by the district that you are often speaking out against. I wonder if you could quickly kind of summarize the battle for integration and equity at Park Slope Collegiate and talk about the opposition that you have faced, not just from parents, but also from the administration.
So the very long history short, Park Slope Collegiate is in the John Jay Building, which sits in the center of Park Slope, and has traditionally served Black and Hispanic students for many, many years, and did so even as Park Slope gentrified. The school started to integrate primarily because the middle-class families in Park Slope were finding that the seats in what were considered to be the acceptable middle schools couldn't house the growing white population at Park Slope. And so there were families looking for another option. And we were an under-enrolled school. A group of parents came to me and said, would you be willing to accept our children if they don't get into their first choice schools as a group? I said, we have room, you're welcome in our school. It's important to know, no gifted and talented programs, no tracking. You're welcome at our school. We would love to integrate, which we firmly believe. One of the things that's happened, though, is that the school is in danger of gentrifying or tipping. And we've been fighting very hard to come up with an enrollment policy on our own that would allow us to maintain more integration. Because coming back to your earlier question, I think one of the other problems, obstacles to integration, is tremendous individualism and the sense that we are all told that schools should serve our own private interests as opposed to our collective interest. And as long as public schools are set up to say, I want the school that will do best by my child, we're set up to say, you know, good luck to you. You should do the same for your child, but you know, it's not really my problem if I win and you lose. It's a problem for me if you win and I lose, but not the other way around. And so that's a problem. That's a challenge that we face. So very specifically, we've created a screen that gives preference to the elementary schools that are more reflective of the demographics of the city, and which also happen to be further away from where our school sits. I had to fight with the DOE to convince them that that was legal. And also, it's a challenge. I mean, you know, in other words, as long as people define the quality of a school by the demographics of the students who go there, then what makes a good school has very little to do with the teaching and learning and very much to do with the kids who go there.
Wait, can I say something?
Sure.
So my experience in my junior high school, which was predominantly Black and Latino, what the majority of us, well, when I say the majority of us, I mean the teachers and the students, because not many students are thinking about this. Most of us were more preoccupied with like getting better resources for the students, you know, getting better funding, you know. So the topic of like integrating like Black and Latinos with like white and Asians, or integrating like low income people with high income people wasn't really seen as a solution. It wasn't really seen as like an option, because like what they just wanted was more funding. And like you know, and for example, in predominantly white and Asian schools and high income, in like schools in like high income neighborhoods, you know, integration isn't really a problem to them. They weren't really affected. They didn't really have any problems because, you know, they had proper funding. So, you know, that's what. So I just feel like, you know, that's I just feel as if like that's what like schools like the ones that I went to like really need, just, you know, more money going to the school.
I think from my reporting, what you're saying is very true. And as being a student myself, I never thought about integration or segregation at all. You go to the school that your parents send you to and you deal with it, and you don't necessarily even know what the options are, what you're missing out on. But I think the data is very clear that, one, it's not just about funding. I don't know that there is a check large enough to actually deal with what it's like to be an instructor in a school where every child is poor and every child is behind. But also, and I'll probably have Fraji talk about this some, one of the things that we learned as parents who are in the middle of a battle, a rezoning battle with PSA and 307, one a very wealthy white school, one a very impoverished Black and Latino school, is access to power that, that segregation deprives entire groups of kids from. That I don't know what 307 could have done to have attracted all of the elected officials who came out for the rezoning meetings of one tiny elementary school in the city. I don't know what an all Black and poor school could do that would ever get that kind of access to power. And I think these are things that kids don't think about, but that as adults we certainly can witness and we can understand. And in the end, those parents got the rezoning. So I think that we should understand that when you're looking at Brown was never really about just resources. It was about equality, and that equality could not come as long as Black and Latino kids are separated and therefore kind of hidden out of the public eye. I would like to talk then about, Joe, you brought up the law. And one thing, of course, that's been very interesting is there was a big Supreme Court in 2007 called Parents Involved. And the Bush administration's reading of Parents Involved was that school districts can no longer take race into account at all. It is unconstitutional, even if they are trying to integrate or maintain integrated schools. The Obama administration has since put out new guidance, of course, saying that that is not true. But a big point of contention in the New York City Department of Education is continuing to hold on to that old reading that does not allow schools to take race into account in any way. And I wonder if, I mean, I know you used to work for, was it Department of Justice Civil Rights Division or Department of Ed?
It was the Office for Civil Rights in the U.S. Department of Ed.
Okay. So I wonder if you could talk about kind of legally where we are and why we have a Department of Education that has been resistant to understand or to embracing a new interpretation by the Obama administration that actually says you can use race.
And do you mean a New York City Department of Education?
Yes, ma'am. Yes.
I don't know why the New York City Department of Education
Can you tell
does.
us where we are legally and how we can still use race?
Yeah, so my old office, in conjunction with the Department of Justice, issued guidance on the use of race to address segregation in schools, or racial isolation in schools. And the standard essentially is that you cannot have two kids, one Black and one white, and pick one or the other on the basis of their race. So you can't do that. But what you can do is, in order to avoid racial isolation, you can group students in ways that are more likely to achieve racial balance. So you can use things for sure like socioeconomic status, zip codes, like I know Jill has done at Park Slope Collegiate. You can use academic performance as a way to increase integration. And if all of those things fail, you are able to use various kinds of groupings of students that would be more likely to yield an integrated student body.
But you can actually, I mean, if you read Parents Involved and you read Kennedy's decision, right, you can use race. You can't use it to look at individual students, but you can, for instance, the Department of Education could draw an attendance zone around two very segregated neighborhoods. And so the Department of Education can look at the racial makeup of two neighborhoods and say, we will draw this attendance zone in a way that will integrate the school.
Right.
Right? So I think like we have come to this place where we think we can't use race at all, but that's actually not what the ruling says or what the Obama administration is how the Obama administration is interpreting.
Right, that's exactly right.
So I think, and we've seen this all over the country where school districts kind of use that ruling as an excuse not to say, well, our hands are tied, we can't do anything, but that's actually not the reality. And there are school districts all over the country, not lots of them, unfortunately, that are using race in that way.
Right, and the New York City, just this summer, there was a chancellor's regulation around student assignment, and the New York City DOE was trying to say you cannot use race, but they did change that after a lot of advocacy.
Great. Okay, I wonder if, Michelle, so you are both a New York City Public Schools teacher, right, and a parent. Could you talk about why, as both an educator and a parent, that integrated schools matter, that why it is not just about something that's convenience or, to bring up a sore spot for the DOE, I'm sure, not something that you can resolve with pen pals from rich and poor schools. If you could actually talk about, in the real ways, the tangible ways that you see both as an educator and a parent, why integration is important for our children, but particularly for Black and Latino children.
Well, my entire career I've taught, except maybe for one year that I taught in District 32, which is,
Where is that for people who don't
that's
know?
in Bushwick.
Okay.
So that's mostly Black and Latino. District 17, also mostly Black, some Latino, my entire career. And I also, as well as I went to schools there. And, for where I teach now at PS 92, I mean, it's an apartheid school. I mean, we're really, super, super isolated. And not only are we isolated, in the community also, there are like very many, shelters are sited there very quietly over the years, And when you talk about that power, there's no power that comes into play when these things happen. And, and on the school level, what that looks like, the resources, I mean, there are very, very few resources. And, what teachers have to do, what we have to do as teachers, as educators, the administration, we have to go into, our pockets and, and also in the classroom, you have, a finite amount of, resources in terms of, emotional and patience and that sort of thing. And in those classes, these are the neediest children, the children that come from the families that, live in high poverty, as well as, they're coming from, having suffered trauma, the families, the children, and all. And, and that's what when I was looking for a school for my son, that's what I was trying to get away from. I mean, that was like kept me up with, night terrors and sweats, Having lived that, as a teacher, having experienced that, having witnessed that, that's not, what I wanted, for my kid. And, and as a parent, I mean, that was the number one thing. I was looking for diversity. It's like, you got to escape. I realized in District 32 where there were no outlets and how everything is, based on, the housing and based on the zoning. I realized, oh my God, I'm trapped, and I have to get him out of here. And we were able to escape, But what it means, that kind of concentrated, segregation, race, poverty, it's, on the ground, boots on the ground. It is bad news. It's not pretty, not at all.
So I think, what you're speaking to is very important because this is what you have when you have such a vastly unequal system, is that you have a lot of parents who want to do the right thing, who want to enroll their kids in integrated schools, but the choices of schools are very minimal. And while, I don't know, which one of you said your kid's school is like United Nations?
That's me, yeah.
So one of the things, of course, that we know is that those handful of schools that are like the United Nations come at the expense of all the other schools where there's no diversity whatsoever. And that beautiful diversity that so many of our, particularly white parents and the middle-class Black parents were able to get into that they enjoy, means that there are other schools that are just absolutely poor. And for instance, when we came to 307, I think our PTA had $200 in the bank account versus PSA, which can raise over $1 million. So I think this is what we're talking about is the structural inequality then makes even people who want to make the right choice, it makes those decisions very hard. I wonder if then you could talk, Faraji, after just going through, you enrolled your daughter, our daughter, in 307, and then undergo this in the middle of a rezoning battle. And for those of you who don't know, I don't know how you could be in Brooklyn and not know, but there was a rezoning battle about whether PSH zone would be shrunk and 307 zone would be enlarged, which in effect would integrate the school if those parents came. I wonder if you can talk about some of the things that you heard, because the headlines around that were also like this shock that Brooklyn hipsters could be racist, or that Brooklyn hipsters would be fighting to have, against having their kids in a school with a lot of Black kids. But I don't know that was surprising to you. it wasn't surprising to me
Yeah.
because I've written about these things for a long time, but I wonder if you can talk about some of the things that you heard from progressive parents and what their fears were about enrolling their kids in 307.
First, I thought it was interesting that the school zone is literally around the perimeter of the public housing area, and that it took a predominantly white school that was overcrowded to get the political machine to open up the zone. That should have been the grievance behind having that school zone so small. That should have been enough for the DOE, the District of Planning, to actually do some type of planning to open that zone up in the first place. Because when you have these small zones, a lot of these schools in Brooklyn are under-enrolled. And you have to think to yourself, is it on purpose? Absolutely, it's on purpose. And it just took affluent white parents to come together and create a movement to have the whole conversation of rezoning to get started. And I thought that was totally unfair. To go,
Now you're going to get to my question?
yes, I am.
This is why you never go on a panel with your wife. Sorry.
So, back to her question. What was your question again?
What did you hear?
I'm saying I wonder if you can talk about some of the things that you heard when you were attending these public meetings. What were the fears that the white parents at PSA were talking about when they knew that they would potentially be rezoned into 307?
And the conversation I was hearing was information about, it was about the safety of the school. They heard there was a school shooting that happened across the street of the school the week before the meetings happened. The behavior issues, there are fights breaking out in the schools. You had issues with, just chaos, basically. And that the school is starving for resources, and the children are starving. They're not getting all the right type of instruction. The test scores are so low. I mean, it got to the point where the rhetoric was, soon I had to stand up and say, have you been to the school? And I was met with silence. It was just amazing that people took that whole perception and ran with it, knowing that my daughter goes there. And I'm like, wait, this is my school. Am I supposed to be there with all this stuff that's going on? Anyone that would have been considering 307 would have never even considered it based on what they've heard. And I thought that type of conversation that was being entertained was just irresponsible. And I think that for those individuals who say, well, that school is not for my son or daughter, what makes you think that it should be for those kids that live in that community? And that is an important thing to think about, is that you have to understand the things that are going on in your community. You have to say, okay, well, I'm a middle-class parent, right? I'm doing pretty good. I have options. You have to look at the neighborhood that you live in and ask yourself a question. If you're progressive and you have these liberal principles, am I an advocate for these kids, or am I the one or am I the accomplice? Am I helping the situation occur for the playing field to be unbalanced? And so regardless if your child is going to a great school that's a quarter of a mile from a school that you think is not doing so well, what's stopping you from advocating for those kids over there or anywhere in your district? And so to just wrap it up, I just think, I think it's important to not think because from what you hear, not actually draw your perceptions based on what you hear. You have to actually go into the school, and you know that test scores are not necessarily an indication that the level of teaching, the quality of teaching is part of that whole equation. So we're all smart people. We have to use our common sense and say, okay, well, the test scores, and then I'm seeing Mandarin classes, and I'm seeing health classes, and I'm seeing second and third graders playing the violin. What type of school is this? And why was it me having to stand up and try to, it was almost as if I was a salesman trying to sell the school. And I didn't feel like I needed to do that. I felt like it should have been a responsibility of those smart parents, instead of saying all of those things, to actually use their feet, walk across the street, and actually attend and visit the school.
So go ahead.
So I hear you in the same way that, you know, at Park Slope Collegiate in the John Jay Building, we heard all of the same things. But the point that you made, Nicole, is that integration has to be about equity. And so that has to be what people are fighting for and what people are demanding. And so if it's just, it's true, you know, people said horrible, horrible things about our school and about our students, and they were wrong. And at the same time, separate is inherently unequal. There is inequity. There are inequities in our system. What we have to decide is there any institution anywhere that wants to embrace equality? And if you're telling, if parents are choosing, you're never going to get individual parents to say, I don't want what's best for my kid. It's not an individual decision. It has to be a collective decision. You know, and if you think about who we're waiting for to give us leadership, you know, I would say in the last year, very close to my hometown, the young people of Ferguson did a lot to give a tremendous amount of leadership to the fight against racism and the fight for equity. It's not going to be an individual parent's decision. That doesn't make any sense. We have to say we need equitable schools. This idea of this school's better or this school, that's got to go away. And the only thing that has ever come close to doing that is school integration. I mean, that, to me, that the conversation about it's up to the students and the parents and the teachers to make each school a good school is going to completely segregate things. That's not the case. So really the question is can we find one? Can we just pick one institution in a sea of tremendous inequity where we want to say, no, we want equal schools, and the only way to do that is to link your interest with my interest, your kid with my kid, and say, you know, we're assigning kids to schools so that they are equitable.
Did you have something to add to that, Tequila?
I think there's so many things. I think we could be here all night. But
That's our plan.
We might have to be out by 8. But so this idea of like whose kids and what do they get is just making me think about this concept of benevolent pathology. This idea of black kids, poor kids, have a lot of problems. There's all these things they don't have. So when they come to school, we have to give them extra time. We have to give them extra didactic, phonics, you know, memorization, give them all the stuff that they don't need. We operate in that framework as opposed to looking at every child as an individual, part of a community that comes with strengths, that our job is to develop their talents, right, their abilities. This is something that Dr. Wade Boykin at Howard is talking about a lot. And the idea of what Jill also said is, what is the purpose of a school? Is it there? Are we having schools to sort kids and say, you're smart, you'll do okay, your parents have resources, you'll do okay? Or is it that every child that is entitled to a free and appropriate education, let us define that very clearly and set the standard very high for what that is, that every child deserves to get the level of education that they are entitled to, and that they can develop their own individual talents regardless of where they're coming from. I don't know that we believe in that as a culture. And so if we're okay with those poor Black and Latino kids getting that kind of instruction because that's what they need, we have to address that, because nobody's going to put your kid in that situation if you have the choice. So we need to really think about that too.
Yeah. I mean, I think clearly when we look at public education as the marketplace, that's a problem. Because public education is, the very foundation of public education in this country, Horace Mann, the father of public education, was that this is a place where no matter where you came from, we could all come into the same place and we would all get the same opportunity to learn. And public schools as market did not provide that. I think it's also important to really focus on what Jill is saying, which is, we are tending to talk about this as individual parents or individual schools or individual principals have to make the choice. But individual parents and schools will never be able to fix inequality across a 1 million student system or in a system of 10,000 students. There's a reason why you can go in any community in this country and see the exact same inequalities, because it is structural, it is built, it is baked in to our system, and it has to be unbaked, and it can't be done individually. So I think that that's critical, because what happens then is a school gets a charismatic leader, and that school ends up doing well, and then that leader leaves, and then the school is back down, and that is kind of how we're depending on these things. So I think that that is exactly right. Does anyone else want to add anything to that?
I think when you have policymakers, you have DOE, you have political officials who make these decisions based on the interests of one particular school, that if you're going to make a change that's going to impact another community, you also need to ask yourself, is the change that you're making is going to be equitable for both or all the communities that are going to be involved, rather than leaving one school that's impacted to make the decisions for themselves is totally unfair, because you know that one school may have all the resources and capital where another school does not. Mm-hmm. So I think that's something that our DOE, I think our political officials really need to think about that with all the development that's going on around Brooklyn. We all know that there's an unfair situation that's going on with our housing. Many of us can't afford to live in downtown Brooklyn. So, of course, your schools are also going to be affected. So ask yourself the question, is that what if the decision-making that you're making is going to be equitable for everyone involved, and so that everyone has a fair take on what they want out of the situation. If one school is overcrowded, then another school might need to have other equitable plans for free and reduced lunch, maybe a choice school, or maybe having another school enroll into a middle school. So you have to just think about those things and make sure that the decision making is equitable for everyone.
Miriam?
Well, that's why, we started an advocacy group called District 15 Parents for Middle School Equity, because of the fact that the way students are assigned to middle school in District 15 and a lot of the choice districts really ends up with that kind of individual free-for-all, resulting in an unfair process for everybody, and also in just tremendous segregation, because the parents with means to navigate this insanely time-consuming and complicated system always end up in what's considered to be the best schools. And we believe there really does need to be a district-wide system to reform this kind of segregation. It can't just be school by school.
Right. Can't be school by school. Absolutely.
And I think that legally, when if somebody were to file a claim on the basis of segregation in any one of these situations, the question is, when you have segregation on the basis of race or national origin or whatever, what is the actual reason for the policy behind the segregation? Is this just that everybody's just flocking to the good schools and it's just kind of a market-based approach where this is just sort of how it ends up? Or is there an actual reason for it? So in our school district, where you have choice on the middle school level, where it's we're drawing students from all across the district, and District 15 is actually a very, very diverse district. But you end up with these schools where you've got the higher concentration of white students, the lower concentration of students who are at free and reduced price lunch, and then the higher test scores. Like, it's just, you can just sort of chart it. And what's the reason for that? So you have to say, is there a legitimate reason that the school district is creating this system which allows for that imbalance? And there's no reason for it sort of in terms of any kind of educational benefit to the students, because time and time again it's been shown, like you've been saying, that integration is really beneficial to schools and to students across the board. But the legal analysis, if a complaint were to be filed, is there a legitimate non-discriminatory reason for separating kids like that? And if you ask that question, there is absolutely no answer for it. And I'm probably not explaining it very well, but so what I guess I'm trying to say is that I think that the district needs, the DOE needs to be the one to take responsibility for this, and that the asking different communities to be responsible for integrating schools on a case-by-case basis, it's not going to work.
So, Teresa, I don't know when we're supposed to go to question and answer. Does anybody?
Oh wait, can I?
Just one sec. Anybody? No? Okay. Go ahead.
Oh well, I wanted to say that integration of schools is very important to have a very diverse school environment. Really is important, but at the same time, you know, your school can't just be like diverse. You know, for example, me, I go to like I said, Brooklyn Technical High School. I guess you could say it's kind of diverse. You have Asian students, you have South Asian students, you have white students. You know, of course, you barely have like Black and Latino students. So you have people from all across the world in one school. But that, you know, I can tell you firsthand, that doesn't necessarily mean that everything's gonna be all right. Like me personally, I do face a lot of racism. I do face a lot of anti-Blackness in my school environment. And, you know, we talk about how funding in schools is very important, you know, to make sure that the students can learn to the best of their ability. But if the students live in a hostile environment where other students are constantly cracking jokes at them or saying very offensive things at them, you know, to the point where this Black student feels anxiety when he enters his next class, it's very toxic, you know. I can tell you firsthand, it's very hard to learn to the best of your ability when you're always worried about what that kid next to you was going to say, what that kid next to you was going to do. And, you know, I can tell you, Black students will tell you this, Black teachers could tell you this. You know, a good amount of us have experienced it. So when we talk about integration of schools, and we talk about, you know, properly funding schools, we should also move the conversation towards how can we make sure that these integrated schools can form an anti-racist, anti-sexist society. You know?
Absolutely. Excellent point. And I think that that's very true for a lot of students. Many of us, I was bused and absolutely was the same experience. I think that that's actually a good segue to what will probably be my final question, which is we need to bring, of course, this back to like talking about race and racism, because what we know is that if white parents in Brooklyn were pushing for system-wide integration would be happening. We know that. So I think that we need to actually talk about the elephant in the room, which is that what the data shows is overall, white parents have very low tolerance for large numbers of Black students in their schools. What the data shows is that what white parents consider integration is actually quite small, particularly with Black students. They would tolerate large numbers of Asian students. They would tolerate significant numbers of Latino students, which is why in this district, even though Latinos are the largest ethnic group, they are less segregated than Black students. And so what the research shows is that as a proportion of Black goes up in schools, the willingness of white parents to enroll their kids in those schools go down, and it actually has nothing to do with test scores. What they show is that when parents are clicking around on websites and looking, the thing that motivates them the most are the demographics of that school. And even if that school has higher test scores, even if a predominantly Black school or a heavily Black school has higher test scores than the white school, those parents will still choose the white school because white is equated with good, quality, and safe. And so I think that until we're able to actually have that conversation about the way that Black and safety and Black and school quality is viewed, then we will continue to talk about how we all would like to have integration and we all want to see it, but let's be very clear, the racial demographics of New York City public schools is what, 16% white? For those, I mean, it's very small, right? So what integration in this city would look like is that white students would be 18% of every school, and I just don't know how many of the people in this audience are willing to put their kids in a school like that. So I wonder if we can bring it back to that conversation. And what we know in New York City is residential segregation has long been the excuse that we've been able to use as to why we can't integrate, but in gentrifying neighborhoods, those schools are not integrating either. There will be some schools that transitionally integrate as white parents come in, and then those schools will flip, but most schools will remain segregated even when the neighborhoods change. So I wonder if we could wrap up before we open the discussion up to the audience and talking about how do we deal with that? And if y'all have an answer, I'll give you like my kid's my child's college fund, which is very small right now. But I think that's the core of what we have to deal with, is that if white New Yorkers are not pushing for district system-wide integration, it's not going to happen. If white New Yorkers were pushing for it, it would happen. But how do we deal with the way that that many people are afraid to enroll their kids in school with lots of Black kids?
So
Now, who's going to answer that?
I'll take that one on a little bit. Look, the civil rights movement wasn't perfect, and the 60s wasn't a perfect period of time, but lots and lots and lots of Black and white people fought against racism, and the leadership of that movement was overwhelmingly Black. It is not impossible to imagine that people want to fight against racism and that they want equality. And I think, again, I actually think we're looking possibly for leadership in the wrong place, right? In other words, to wait, there are lots and lots and lots of people in this city, and if we said collectively, in an integrated way, that what we need in our schools is equality, and you can't in this country fight for equality without fighting racism. That those two things have to go together. There's no way to discuss equality and equity without taking on racism. So, in my school, we have a minority of white parents still. In the middle school, that's changing a little bit. And one of the things, and again, it's not a Garden of Eden, but there is a real commitment across all of the constituencies in the school in terms of students and parents and teachers to fighting the racism that our students experience. So there's been an integrated fight back against the metal detectors. There's been an integrated response to abuse of our students in the neighborhood. There's a lot of things that we can do, but I have to say we should take some lessons from history, right? That the most effective fights for equality anywhere in the world, for the most part, have been anti-racist, and nobody was waiting for middle-class people to lead those.
Also, race is not the Black problem. That's why I want people to be clear. It's not the Black problem. It's the white problem, too. And I think sometimes it makes white people feel uncomfortable to talk about it, but I call race that undigestible vegetable, right? You have Brussels sprouts, you have collard greens, you have salad. Sometimes you don't want to eat it, but you know that if you eat it, it's healthy for you. The dialogue about race is a healthy conversation. If you talk about it, you can live by it. If you live by it, you can change things with it, and it's good for you. It's good for your body to talk about it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Can I?
Eat your vegetables. Is what I'm saying. Eat your vegetables.
Yeah. We're all going to go out and get Brussels sprouts. Just to piggyback on that, I think we might be beginning this conversation in the wrong place, because I think you can't expect people to, use their children to integrate if they themselves as adults aren't doing that. And we haven't really talked about the fact that like most people have friends and interact with and have dinners at and go to homes of people who look just like them. And so, of course, when it comes to, well, will I put my child in that predominantly Black environment? Well, if you're not doing it yourself, of course you're going to say hell no and find all kinds of reasons why you don't want to put your child through that. But let's really have an honest conversation and say, what do our peer groups look like? Who's Jacqueline Woodson says, you know, you can have lunch with coworkers, but do you go to their houses?
Absolutely.
And so we really have to look in the mirror at ourselves as adults because we are the ones who lead the way for children. So let's really be honest with ourselves.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that 100%. The conversation about, you know, race and segregation in these communities is a conversation that we should always be having. You know, I have it every day. You guys probably have it every day, like your Brussels sprouts. You know, have it every day. And it's not just. It's good that we're having this conversation. You know, it's good that we're having the conversation. And as I look around, you know, I see a lot of very, you know, engaged adults, you know, in this room having a conversation. You know, I barely see any young kids. And, you know, these are the people that we're putting in these schools. This is people that we're integrating in the schools. So I feel like it's important for us to make sure that we have, like, a conversation similar to this, maybe in the same room, maybe around...
The next thing.
Yeah, like, maybe same room, but like, with children, with, like, the students that we're trying to integrate. You know, hopefully we can make such a conversation happen, because then that would really push us forward, you know. So maybe at the start of the school year, when these kids are finally going into the school, like September, October, or something, we can have the same conversation, you know.
Well, I just wanted to add that one of the things our organization is trying to do in our district, and we're also very aware that as an organization, the steering committee at least is predominantly white middle class, but we are trying to bring the discussion about middle school equity and middle school choice to the whole district. And so we have a proposal where we want to have a series of structured conversations where we bring together all the different stakeholders, whether it's the school principals, both on the elementary and middle school level, and trying to involve as many parents as possible from across the district so that we can have a conversation about how students are assigned and how we can make some real change. And so we're still trying to push for that from the CEC, but as of yet, there has not been a response to our proposal to do that.
Did you want to say something?
Yeah, I just, the school that I work at, it's a co-located school, so there's a charter school in the building. And there's this gentleman that I've been seeing over the years, and he's a white gentleman. I mean, the school is like 80, it's a hyper-segregated, you know, apartheid school, but there may be a few white families that that send their children to the charter school. And I stopped him the other day because I'm like, wow, it's like, he had the child stay in this school from kindergarten all the way till 5th grade, and I wanted to get in his head, and I asked him, I'm like, you're a white guy, you know what I'm saying? And you have this, you know, so I didn't get a chance to really talk to him, but I was thinking about, it was a new school, it was a charter school, and I was thinking about how the district school that I teach in and all the other schools, you know, like the charter, there was like this sense of newness, this sense that we were all getting together, it was on the ground, investing in this new thing, and everybody was all in this together. Whereas, and it made me think about how the district schools were. I mean, there's that sense that, you know, these schools have been abandoned. They've been left to, you know, and he couldn't put his kid in that school, but he could put his kid in this new charter school where there's this new life and there's new investment. And, you know, and I kind of think that, yeah, it goes back to, you know, the whole issue of equity. You know, if we were to pump the resources into a lot of these schools, I think we'd see a lot, you know, of different outcomes.
And that made me think of when we were sitting in one of these meetings about the rezoning of 307 and PS8. And one of the things that one of the PS8 parents said is like, nobody would choose to have their kid in 307. And I just remember how thinking about that and what that says about who we think are deserving of good schools, who are deserving of an education, what choice does, which obviously privileges certain parents. But then something that you said also, and I think this is a good way to end it, we really have to think about like that we're surprised when we see a white parent in a school like that. It means that we expect this for black and brown parents. We expect that black and brown parents will be trapped in these types of schools. And until we are able to like unlink those two things, it's very hard to see the kind of progress that we're going to make. And so I think that's a good place to end it. Should we open it up to questions? Okay.
This has been an excellent program, and we do need to talk about race. But I want to point out, my name is Darryl Rock. I was a principal for 10 years in Brooklyn, District 13, at Benjamin Banneker High School. And this is what I want the panel to think about. Our school was totally segregated. All black kids, all black teachers. And we had the highest graduation rate in New York State for black students. Okay, so the point is, and this goes to what Nathaniel was talking about, maybe we don't need to go to those schools. If we put the energy and effort into improving our schools, and what do you think the kids think about, oh, I have to go with them so that I'm better? We have the ability to, like, and if you look at the black colleges, Howard, this is our history.
That's it.
We don't need to go to those schools, but we have to get the right people to educate our children. Again, our school, all black kids, all black teachers, is a wonderful place for kids to go to school. And you don't have to deal with some of the things that this young man might have to deal with. You have people that cared about you, that weren't afraid about you, and we're going to motivate and push you to make sure that you were successful.
I mean, absolutely. I think, of course, we actually chose to enroll our child in a segregated school intentionally. But I just as a reporter have to point out that experience is exceptional.
Right.
That is not the norm. You almost never find high schools. You can sometimes find segregated elementary schools that are producing the same results, but that is not the norm anywhere in the country, and educators will tell you that. It's not. I mean, it's not arguing that it doesn't happen. It's saying that is not the norm, and that is not the experience that most kids in these schools are experiencing. The other thing is that there is no, what I have found sadly, because I'm a cynical person after studying education for a long time, is there is no perfect experience for black children. Whether they are in a segregated school or integrated school, it's a matter of mitigating which burden will my child have, because there will be one, and that is clear. And I guess the last thing that I would say is, we have been, since Plessy v. Ferguson in the 1800s, promising to make separate equal for black kids. We have not done it. For a single day, in a single district, in a single school, we have not done it. So I think to keep hoping that eventually we will do it, that eventually when you separate all the poor black kids in one school, that people in power will one day give those kids what they deserve, we just haven't seen it. It's just not based in reality.
But have you ever seen where white people want to go to school with black? It's not going to happen. They don't want to go to school with them.
Look at the South. It has happened.
So it's okay.
It has happened.
They do not want to go to school with us, so it's okay. We love to have them come, but if they don't come, that's fine. But we can educate our children. And if you look back at the segregated schools in the South, before integration, those kids were successful. There's a book called Their Highest Potential. Everybody needs to get and read it. It talks about those segregated schools in the South. And the culture that was in those schools is what led to those kids being successful. Let's focus on that. Let's focus on improving the culture that's in those schools, how we look at those kids, how we treat them. Our kids are beautiful children. 307, I worked last year with 307. I was in that building every day. Beautiful children.
Absolutely.
Okay? They don't have to go to school with somebody else to be successful.
Right.
No one's arguing. I think we should probably do both, because we're not going to have wide-scale segregation. But if there's a reason why the Supreme Court decided Brown v. Board, and it's because those schools were not equal in the South either.
Hi, my name is Sarah, and I'm the founder and co-director of Integrate NYC for Me, which brings young people into the conversation. And I'm also an ESL teacher in District 7, which is 95.5% Black and Latino, and Arab, which is usually not categorized properly in those categories. But what I want to say is that I really appreciate what you're saying, especially working in District 7. And my students, when I showed them the map that we created off of the UCLA's report that said racial mixing in New York City is 10% of 3 races represented, my students who've attended predominantly Black Latino schools said, no way. You showed me that the citywide demographics are 15% white, and you showed me that there's 70% Black Latino students. Why did you create a map like this? And it really made me think. And so I'm curious from the panel if we think as a city that doesn't necessarily reflect that those categories by the UCLA, should we be accepting that report, three categories of 10% of different races representing integration? Do we see that as some kind of a fairly mixed school, or do we see a school that has over 40% white youth as possibly also being segregated? How can we have that conversation in a city that's predominantly Black and Latino students? So I was curious what people thought about that.
Anyone want to answer that?
No.
I can just say legally, I mean, they're doing that because of desegregation suits and the way that integration has been defined legally in these suits, but that's a different question. I mean, that's the reasoning why they're doing it, but.
Yeah, I'm not sure I understand what you mean by 10% of 3 categories. Can you explain that?
The report said that a racially mixed school, the UCLA said, a racially mixed school is any school that has 3 races represented at a minimum of 10%. And so that could mean that a school could have more than 50% white youth, 10% Asian youth, 10% Latino, and still be racially mixed. And I'm saying in New York, should we be accepting that those numbers as representing possible metrics of integration, or should we be asking for things that more so reflect our districts, more so reflect our citywide averages?
I think actually the legal standard is that you look at the percentage of school population in comparison to the district that it draws from, or the pool that it draws from. So you can't say
Right.
that a school is segregated if it's 50-50 or if it's 80-20, because you want to see what's the population that it's drawing from. So it depends on the area, the zone, what it looks like.
I'm pretty sure that, I mean, UCLA is using the dissimilarity index, and that takes into account what the demographics of a district is, and then how far askew are the schools from the overall demographics of the district. I mean, what are the 3 racial groups that you're talking about? Black, white, and Latino?
So it's saying that a school that has, let's say, 89% Black and Latino youth a school that has less than 10% white youth is minority segregated, point blank. But some of the students in my class were saying, if we have a school system that's over 75% Black and Latino, or we have these districts, why would this report come out and then report in this way that makes it seem like anything over 70% is bad, or that we're using these words like apartheid to shock? And so I'm wondering, should we be pushing back in certain ways that certain schools that have this critical mass of Black and Latino students is something to be concerned about? Kind of going with your question, what you said, it kind of creates that fear in a way if we're looking at that report and we're accepting all of the categories. Something my students brought up.
Right. So we have the district is about 30% or so. There's some district folks, right? Asian and white.
District 13?
No, not sorry. I say district. The school system. It's about. 15% Asian, 15% white. Right. So that would mean that racial balance would be that same thing. So I think apartheid schools are apartheid schools. Schools that are 1% white or less, it doesn't matter what the demographics of a district are. I don't know that we can argue that those schools are not intensely segregated. And I think that's what that report is doing. And its cutoff was 90% and 99%. And so even in New York City with our demographics, a school that is 90% is still an intensely segregated school. But UCLA does adjust for the demographics of a district, but you get to a certain point where it just is what it is, and it doesn't matter where you're living.
Hi, this was a really interesting discussion. My name is Gail. I'm a writer. I just had a couple of you, I know Nikki in particular, mentioned schools in the South that have managed to integrate, that the most segregated schools are no longer in the South but are now in the North. And I wonder if as we look to confront this problem in New York, if there are any lessons we can take from some of these districts in other parts of the country that maybe have done a better job than we have.
We could mandate it. I mean, that's essentially what happened in the South. There was mandated desegregation, and there are lessons to be learned. Choice as a strategy was created by the segregationists in the South as a response to desegregation. So we could do away with choice. Tracking of students based on assumed academic ability was also something that was a response to desegregation, so that schools that were building wide were integrated. The schools themselves weren't really integrated. So we can learn from that mistake and stop tracking students and stop defining students by a test score or past academic performance, and basically just say we're in favor of equity. I mean, I think we have to come back to that. This idea that we really want the same school experience for all of our students, that there is not a student in the city that does not deserve to go to a high-quality school, is a little more of a radical idea than I think that we're accepting here. That we really think it's fine if all of our schools are of equal quality. And that doesn't mean that they'll be mediocre or bad. There's nothing that says that there's a contradiction between equity and excellence. So the idea that the only way that you can create good schools is by having students and families compete for them is a complete fallacy. So, the other thing I want to say is that the schools that were most successful in the South were also very much immersed in the civil rights movement. Right? In other words, the desegregation and the integration of schools in the South didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened in a moment in history where there was tremendous commitment to confronting and addressing racism, and we need to do that.
Yes.
School integration is a necessary but not sufficient condition for creating integrated schools. So you have to start by bringing the students together in the same school, and then there's a lot of work that needs to be done to make sure that racism is constantly confronted and addressed.
I would just add, one of the reasons the South was successful is there were county-wide school districts. So when a district was ordered to desegregate, you either went to that school or you had to pay for private school. In the North, the way that we accomplish segregation is sometimes dozens of different little school districts in white communities where all you have to do to avoid integration is move 5 miles up the road, or in New York City, you move into another neighborhood. So I think, again, integration, if you really want it, there's going to have to be a radical shift. It is going to be radical because there was a great deal of effort put forth in creating the segregation. We have not been willing to have that equal effort in undoing it.
Hello, I'm a grad student at SUNY Downstate, and a question that kind of piggybacks off of what you just said. So how can the policymakers and the Board of Education, how are they qualified to make a decision to fix the problem of integration, and how do we include and bridge the gap between teachers, parents, and students into that conversation?
In our case, I think they're going to have to come up with ingenious ways of engaging community. That means not just having the meetings and having engagement at the school. You have to meet those people where they're at. What we were able to do with, in regards to zoning, it wasn't enough to just say no. We had to have an action plan. So we drafted an action plan, and we were able to go out into the Farragut community and get them to sign a petition. We went all in through their community and got 400 signatures. And I think that type of outreach is something that is needed for these for our DOE and our politicians to campaign. If you do this when you're ready to campaign for the elections. So we need to do this every single time and engage the community in the way they need to be engaged.
Okay, anyone else want to address specifically? Your question was policymakers? What should?
How are the policymakers and the Board of Education qualified to make the decision on how to integrate schools when I see there's a different perspective from the teachers and the students and the parents?
So are you asking, from a policy perspective, there's a million examples out there. You know, in other words, the school desegregation in terms of how do you create the student assignment policies, there are lots of examples. If the question you're asking is how do you create the political will and the political support among all of the constituencies, I would say that's not so much a question for policymakers as it is for us.
Well, the question is for the parents, teachers, and the students. Like, how do you get everyone on the same page when it comes to the idea of integration?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think part of it is we have to do it. And in doing it, we get one to it. I think if we wait until we have the perfect answer of how we're going to do this without any missteps and without any mistakes, it won't happen. You know, and in a lot of ways, we have much higher standards for how we go about running integrated schools than we do for allowing segregated schools, right? I mean, like this system just happens, and trust me, it's not good. And yet we're letting we just sit back and we say, well, this is okay. But if we want to make a change, then oftentimes there's this feeling of, well, until we can do it perfectly, which we're certainly not doing now with segregated schools, I think we just have to do it and sort of demystify it. And we'll figure it out.
I also wanted to add on to that. I just have a quick question for that. Is there anyone here who's part of like the Board of Education? Anyone here?
Yeah.
Oh.
The Department of
Oh, we
Ed?
got a good amount of people. So I asked that because I feel like the solution to that would be a conversation where we put people who are on the Board of Education, you know, kind of maybe on the stand and have, you know, teachers and and you have, you know, teachers, parents, and students, you know, demanding answers from these people, demanding solutions, maybe like hashing out some type of action plan to integration.
That's the next panel.
In a discussion like this. Yeah.
You know, when I you know, was thinking about, you know, coming here and doing the panel and everything, you know, as a teacher, not as a parent, as a teacher, and you know, that was before I became a parent, I was parent to all those children that I taught, and that was the thing that bothered me. How does the parents, the community in the district that I work in, how are we a part of that conversation about integration and diversity and that? We're left, what does that conversation look like? We're left out of that. I mean, I'd look around where, you know, in District 14, District 15, you know, they would have these town halls talking about these, District 13 even, but, you know, there are a lot of communities that are left out of that conversation. I don't think that we can look to the Department of Education. You know, they haven't taken any leadership, you know, to answer your question. We can't look to them. But, you know, we do what we can do. I mean, as a teacher, you know, as a member of the community, you know, I know with my union, you know, the union of MORE, Movement of Rank and File Educators, we're the social justice arm of the UFT, and that's what we want. We want to join with the parents. You know, we want to join with the students. You know, and have these conversations. But I don't think that we can expect, you know, any leadership, you know, from the Department of Education.
My name is Ethan Moskowitz. I'm a student, an 8th grader at Park Slope Collegiate. Jill Bloomberg School. That's you. That's you right there. You know, she was talking about earlier how, you know, everyone, you know, all the people want to go to the schools that they think are best, and you know, that's But, everyone wants another option, and that's where me and my mom, that's where we want it to be. We want another option, and we experimented with that other option by going to Parcel Collegiate, and I have no regrets at all about going to this school. Yes, I have a question. But I want to know, of all the kids, in elementary school, for the middle school, they want to go where their friends are. I want to know how, we can get students more active in what we're accomplishing here, because we need another voice in this. We need a younger voice that can, that can carry this, and if we have more student voices, I think that could really give an impact of what we're doing to try and integrate the schools.
I would, give them that mic back, because I would ask, why ask adults how we can get students? I think you should say, what do you think adults up here and in the district and in the DOE should be doing to get you guys engaged and hear your voices? You didn't know I was going to turn it back on you, huh?
Yeah, I figured as much. We need to really show kids what's happening. We need to show them. Okay, to integrate the schools, we need to do this. For this to happen, this thing needs to happen. We need adults in the DOE to show us how. We need adults in the DOE to show us how we can do this, and everyone's kind of clueless, I guess. Everyone's, we just want to go
clearly.
I know. We just want to go all. Everyone just wants to go where their friends are, and what we need to do is show them that that's not all of it. That's, yeah.
Thank you. Nathaniel.
Can I just respond? So I think there's one way we can frame this as a curriculum issue, right? And so from the time children are born, you can start talking with them and framing society in terms of social justice challenges. And in my personal example, my son goes to a school that had a very high rate of children opting out from high-stakes testing. Well, the parents did. And so I had this conversation with my son who said, but I think I'll do well on the test. I think I'll be fine. I want to take it. So we started shifting the conversation to, well, what does this mean in the larger context? So when my child was in 4th grade, he understood that there are children in other parts of this community, of this city, that don't have access to the kind of education he has. They don't get to talk about these kinds of issues because they're spending so much time test prepping, and this actually impacts their lives. So he has to participate in a social justice way in education. I think you can do the same thing around middle school, right? So if they're focused on real, deep, intense, culturally relevant curriculum and learning and assessment, then kids are going to come to these conclusions and say, yeah, I want to be with my friends, but guess what? I have a role to play in equity in this society. So it's part of our responsibility to create spaces that allow for children to stand up and to be able to know that this is an important place that they can take a stand.
Did you want to say something, Nathaniel?
Yeah, I was gonna, what better way to do it than to have, the same discussion like this, but with students, and students and members of the DOE, members of the Board of Education, where we can tell them what's going on, why it's going on, and then we can ask them what they think about it, and we can ask them what solutions they may have, because some of them may be as into this as we are. I know a lot of students who are into this issue with integration of schools, segregation of schools, inequality of schools as we are. So it's good to open up such a panel, such a conversation with students, similar.
Thank you. Do we have?
Yeah, we have time for 2 more questions. Okay. I'm trying to spread it out.
Hi, so I want to piggyback off something Michelle was talking about. I wanted to know what the role of charter schools play in integration and your opinions of charter schools generally, Because I know there's a lot of politics involved in that, and that's something I've really been interested in talking to teachers about. Want to know what their thoughts are on that.
The roles that, well, I noticed, like, for in central Brooklyn, where I am, 17, District 16, maybe 19, 23, East New York, Browns. I mean, there's like an epidemic of charters, you know what I'm saying? I mean, there have been these communities, I mean, like for my school, 25% of the elementary schools in District 17 are charterized and co-located. Not a single school that's in a freestanding, their own building, a single charter school. And I believe that's part of the plan. I don't know what the big master plan is, but that's a part of it. And that's where the conversation is, you know what I'm saying? As opposed to, having these discussions about, equity and, segregation and diversity. When I talk about that before, that vacuum and that absence of conversation, that's what it is. And, it's like, for me, I mean, it's not acceptable because in this instance, with the charter schools, they are even more segregated. We know that, So we know when the policy is about citing and co-locating and citing charter schools in certain communities, and it's uneven. It's completely uneven. To me, that says right there, we don't want to have that conversation about equity, and we don't want to have, this is what we're going to give you instead. This is what has been inflicted on these communities instead. Charter schools, I don't like charter schools at all.
I would just say, and I don't wade into charter school.
Yeah.
That's, I mean,
Okay.
You want to get your Twitter feed blown up, talk about charter schools. But what I will say is that charter schools are clearly symptomatic of people who feel trapped in the schools that are serving their neighborhoods. And that in a system of choice where lots of parents have none, which are the parents that they were talking about at my daughter's school, where they said no one would choose to be in this school, charter schools are going to flourish in a system of tremendous inequality. So whether you feel, I think often the data shows that they are, what's that, jumping from the kettle or pot, whatever. They're not going into a better situation, but you have parents who don't have any choice, who feel, at least I have a say about where I send my child. And I think until inequality is addressed in the system, you're going to continue to see charter schools flourishing.
So I'm a teacher assigned for a citywide district. I've seen charter schools all over. And what I'm fascinated by is I'd love to do a photojournalist thingy, I'm blanking on words right now, but where you take a picture of the charter school class and the teacher in particular and notice the same building, same address, but the name of the school is different in the photo. And you'll be fascinated to see what is in the school that is the public school, what is in the charter school, and what is in the possibly other public school there. And you'll see a vast difference of resources. And so my main question is, we've been talking a lot about racial equality and diversity, but I'm curious about services. We've talked a lot about, or you have, not we, you guys have talked a lot about services, in particularly PTAs, parent involvement, but also like special education services. Primarily, I've been noticing a trend, especially in District 15, no offense, of white parents trying to get special education services for handwriting problems or small things here and there, while in other districts it seems to be very, very disproportionately. I've been in the system for 8 years, 7.5, sorry, and I've never not worked in a segregated school. So I'm very curious, what do you do to address the different services for students, especially for IEP students in the system, and how do you make that equity? Because it seems to be a lot of parent involvement is what gets a student with special needs through the system rather than the system itself helping it.
Does one of the teachers or Jill want to tackle that?
Yeah, again, if the school system is set up as a market system and parents are viewed as consumers of education, the marketplace has never been equal, and the consumers with the most purchasing power get the most out of the market. So you're right, in a system that's set up where we're not creating schools that serve the public, and where we define all of us, where we need to define the public, then you're right, that's going to happen. And it charter or non-charter, it really doesn't matter. This idea of we have this phrase at our school, which we gently say to ourselves and also to our students, it's not all about you. And it's a good message for us to remember.
Okay. With that, I would say the fact that we're talking about this in New York City is a sign of progress. Even though I am a cynical person, 5 years ago, these conversations would not be happening. So I think we just need to keep the momentum going. There are examples of communities that we can look to who are actively working on these issues, who have had some success. And so hopefully we'll have that next panel with the DOE, and then we'll have the next panel with the students. Have a good night.